Welcome to those who are beginning to join us online for this IAS symposium. And we are very delighted to be welcoming a number of people online, as well as an absolute full house and a very noisy, lively full house, which has been very delightful actually to have in the building, especially on this very cold and wet morning. My name is Marcia Nesman. I'm the director of the Institute of Advanced Studies. I'm just going to allow a few more minutes for people to join us online while we begin the convention, and then I'll do a little bit of housekeeping, and I will say a few words about the symposium and the events of this week. And then I will be turning over to a colleague from the University of Birmingham, Gillian Wright, who will be then actually beginning the process of the symposium. So I can welcome people who are coming in online. If you are beginning to come in online, you are in a webinar environment, and the webinar does have a chat and a Q&A. They're at the bottom of your screen. You can feel absolutely confident in feeding questions into the wider session through that mechanism. We're going to monitor that throughout the day. So please do use the chat and the Q&A functions for this. I'd also remind you that the talks are being recorded and will appear on the IAS website, usually approximately a week after the event. They will only be the talks, so we will not be recording the dialogue and the conversation after. We will edit that, so people are very free to comment and have a discussion online, only the talk parts, which will then become podcasts on our IAS site. And part of our video library, so that people can be referred to those if they want to hear them after the fact. So please do feel free to use the chat, use the Q&A, and have wide open conversation and dialogue. And there are no GDPR issues, there are no data processing or handling or mishandling issues possible around that. So that is absolutely a-okay. Colleagues are still joining for a moment online. Welcome if you're online, and if you've only just joined us to this IAS hybrid event. We have a full house in the room, and also a nice group now joining online. Please feel free to use the Q&A and the chat functions, and be aware that they will not be kept, stored, or any commentary recorded, only the talks. Welcome to those who are still joining online. If you've just joined us online, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you will notice that there is a button for chatting and a button for Q&A. You are welcome to use either of those two functions throughout the day to ask questions, make comments. We'll make sure that those are fed into the wider discussion. Welcome if you are joining online. Okay, I think we've reached numbers. So with that, then, I can now open this more formally. Welcome to the IAS, welcome to the Institute of Advanced Studies, and very much welcome to International House to those who have joined us for this really exciting day's event on editing Aphra Behn's fiction, but also for those who are in the room and online. This is a week of events, actually, while the editorial team, an absolutely stellar group of colleagues, joining us both internationally, in some instances as IAS visiting fellows, and also from a range of institutions across the UK, who are working on this major project of editing Aphra Behn's fiction for Cambridge University Press. And I am sitting at a table with one of the volumes here, award-winning volume, and it is really thrilling to be able to welcome people to what is a working week of discussions and events, as well as this open seminar and symposium today that enables people to join us from a wider group and constituency to understand some of the issues that are at stake in editing Aphra Behn's fiction. And so we are really thrilled to host a fantastic group of scholars here. As I said a bit earlier, for those tuning in, I'll be turning over to Gillian Wright in a moment to actually begin to introduce the first session, and the sessions will each be chaired by a different individual who will introduce the speakers and the subject of the session and manage that session. So I'm not even going to begin to try to step into the shoes of discussing this as a specialist topic, but I do want to say something quite specific, which is that I'm really delighted that the IAS has been able to support this fantastic project. I've known about this project for a number of years. And specifically, this project being convened by my colleague, Elaine Hobby, who is Professor Emerita in English here at Loughborough University, whom I realized as I was beginning to think about the introduction of today, I met last century. So Elaine and I go back quite a while. But critically, I wanted to say something about this in the sense that I came to Loughborough in 1998 and met Elaine, who was already here. And Elaine was, I came to Loughborough as somebody who was working on women in modernism and contemporary visual practice. And working in an area of women's kind of cultural contribution, both historically and in the contemporary field, can sometimes, and did sometimes in that period, feel like a slightly lonely activity. But when I joined, Elaine was already here, working very much in the same terrain, and actually was also part of introducing me to a number of other women and feminist scholars who were working in the field. And it was a really exciting and dynamic time. And Loughborough has long hosted some really exciting feminist scholarship across both the arts and the sciences on the issues around women's contribution, both historically and in the contemporary world, to really serious and major areas of scholarly work. And Elaine has been part and parcel of that. Now that over the years has come to be much more mainstreamed, much more kind of recognized. And we even have a wonderful network of scholars and kind of a networking of women in the university through Maya Network and so forth now. But there has also always been a long history of mentorship among feminist scholars at the university and more widely. And I just want to say something about Elaine having been really pivotal to that at this university. And therefore, it is a wonderful thing to be able to move kind of almost full circle nearly 30 years later to say, to be able to host something as fantastic as this project and to be able to use the resources of the IAS centrally to say something about that. And it is our absolute pleasure to welcome a stellar group of international and UK-based scholars working on Aphra Behn for a week of exciting discussion and dynamic debate. So thank you, Elaine, for this, and thank you to all those who are joining us over the course of this week. And with that, I'd like to turn to Gillian.
Well, thank you very much, Marcia. I should briefly introduce myself. I'm Professor Gillian Wright, as Marcia said, I'm a professor at the University of Birmingham. I'm also one of the general editors on the Cambridge Aphra Behn, for which I'll be editing Behn's poetry. And as Marcia mentioned, this is already a prize invitation, which is a rather wonderful way to get an edition underway. Our talks today are going to specifically relate to one area of Behn's very multifarious and complex writing, her prose fiction. All of the speakers you'll be hearing from today are involved in one of two volumes of the Cambridge edition devoted to prose fiction, volumes 6 and 7. And as we will hear in the course of the day, this is a particularly exciting part of the edition to be part of, because Behn's prose fiction is so various, so varied and interesting in terms of length, styles, subjects. It also raises, in some parts, interesting issues of attribution, which we'll hear about in the course of today. So in the next hour or so, we'll be hearing from 3 of our editors. I should say at this point that we are going to be later in the day missing one person whom we'd hope to have join us. That's Professor Ross Ballister from Oxford, who has not been able to join us today for medical reasons. But we have some wonderful speakers to look forward to in the course of the day. And in the first hour, we're going to be hearing from Aleksondra Hultquist, Lena Cottegnies, and Jenny Batt. And I will hand over to Alex to get us underway now.
Hi, thank you. I'm supposed to stand here, right? Or I'm sitting. Oh, wonderful. That's even better. The first thing I'd like to say is thank you very much to the IIS. It's starting to occur to my home institution, Stockton University, in little town in South Jersey at the shore, that my scholarly pants might actually be as fancy as I've been telling you. So I appreciate that. And here is my talk here. I actually had my students vote on what would be the most exciting way to produce the information I wanted. And this was their favorite, the passions of love letters and what the history of emotion teaches us about the first novel in England. And so the first thing you need to know about this era is that there is no such thing as the novel. There are romances, there are true histories, there are true stories. We've decided these are novels. Nothing looks like Dickens or Austen or any of the people that we have come to decide write novels. Nothing looks like that. We're inventing it, and we're using the word and the term new. The second thing that you understand is that they're very, very bad things to read. They will corrupt you. And here are just some really fun quotes that happened in the 18th century. These amorous passions, right? This is one of the problems that novels aroused, amorous passions, which his romance is designed to paint to the utmost life, are apt to institute themselves into their unwary readers, and by an unhappy inversion, a copy shall produce the original. So, of course, if you read about Sylvia and Philander, and yes, that is where we actually get the word, by the way, comes from this character, you'll turn in to Sylvia and Philander, who not only have an incestuous relationship, but go out across Europe to avoid her father, and pregnancies, and it's just terrible. If you read the book, that's what will happen to you. You have to be very careful. But it gets even more interesting if you look at this 1796. I have actually seen mothers in miserable garrets crying for the imaginary distress of an heroine while their children were crying for bread. And the mistress of a family losing hours over a novel in the parlor while her maids, in emulation of the example, were similarly employed in the kitchen. And you know how they were employed in the kitchen? Yes, they were masturbating with carrots, apparently. So novel reading is very bad. This is one of my favorites. It's a different country for different reasons, but I just want to point out to you that you can be admitted to a lunatic asylum for being kicked in the head by a horse, leading an immoral life, being lazy, having tobacco and masturbation, fever. I like this, fever and the loss of a lawsuit, as if they weren't connected, you wouldn't be. There's novel reading, female disease and women trauma, deranged masturbation, very concerned about masturbation in the early novel. And this is just a very bad thing. You didn't want to read novels. Okay, so now that I've told you there is no novel and they're horrible, and I'm saying, no, the reason I'm telling you this is because it's the first novel and it's wonderful. And so here it is, Love Letters to a Nobleman and His Sister. It came out in three volumes. So the first volume comes out in 1684, and that's sort of the one I'm going to concentrate on for the few minutes that I have. And this was based on the true story of the great scandal that went to trial in 1682 between Ford Lord Grey and Henrietta Berkeley, who you can see up here. And Ford Lord Grey was married to Henrietta's older sister, seduced Henrietta away, married her to his servant, so that the father could not follow them and bring the law on them. And this is purportedly the letters that happened before they ran away together. The trial is about them running away and who is, whether or not the father can get his property, and that is Henrietta back. She's lost her value by running away. So she's writing these letters as a way to describe why what happened. Now, this is where it starts to get interesting, right? Because clearly, amorous emotion and masturbation just go hand in hand when we're looking at it in the 18th century and later. But early on, this is actually a very sophisticated way of trying to capture into words how people feel when they feel what they do. Right? We know we're not doing plays now. We can't act in love. Instead, we have to represent it through prose. And here's one of the great lines. When a true view is taken of the soul, when no base interest makes the hasty bargain, when no conveniency or design of drudge or slave shall find it necessary, when equal judgments meet that can esteem the blessings they possess and distinguish the good of either's love and set a value on each other's merits, and where both understand to take and pay. This is the description of love that is offered. I'll say it's also the description of my second marriage, but not my first. So there is this notion, right, that love is a very sophisticated feeling, and it's very hard to capture into words. And this is another one, right? My fault, Sylvia claims, right, is only love. And that sure I should boast as the most divine passion of the soul, right? Love is heavenly, love is divine. No, no, Philander, 'tis not my loves that's criminal. No, nor the placing it on Philander the crime, but 'tis thy most unhappy circumstances. He is married, she cannot marry him. He is married to her sister, therefore the relationship is incestuous by law at that time. Because family connections matter more than blood connections in some ways. But this is what I believe Behn and some of the early writers of the novel that's not a novel yet are actually trying to explore. So what we might read and laugh at, oh, this overblown passion, how silly, whoever feels like that. They feel like that. They're trying to understand how to put into words what being in love, obsessed, knowing it's the wrong thing, knowing it's not good for you. Apparently it's worse for smart women because smart women know that they're in love and it's not a good idea, but they can't talk themselves out of it. So if you're a smart woman, you're really not in a good place. But for the next 40 years, I argue that this is what's going on in one version of the early novel. We are trying to make a sophisticated argument about what love feels like in prose. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Alex. And wonderful, thank you. Then that's a lot for everybody else today.
Yeah.
Just a couple of things. So our second speaker this morning is Cottegnies, who is editing Behnn's text Lamont.
Well, thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. So, since we were asked to talk about problems, some problems we encountered as editing Behn, I thought I would talk to you about the difficulty for an editor, not just of editing one text, Behn's Lamont or The Lover's Watch, but also implicitly its original, since it's a translation. So Lamont was published in 1686, and although it's presented on its title page as a work by Mrs. Behn, it's an adaptation of an extremely successful French work published originally in 1666. Written in prose interspersed with verse, this witty narrative reads like a long prescriptive letter sent by Iris to her lover Damon, a courtier, in which she describes hour by hour, over 24 hours, how he should occupy his time in her absence. The difficulty for the editor, I think, is providing the necessary semantic and cultural elucidation, as well as the literary and cultural mediation necessary for contemporary readers, which means in particular indicating the radical departures from the French, but also letting readers make up their own minds about the significance of the changes without dictating to them what they should think, but also so significance of the changes, additions, and omissions, and without making the critical text too cumbersome. I mean, so I think it's something that we've all shared. So the mid to late 1680s were busy years for Behn. As you've just heard, she launched into a new phase of her career as a prose writer with her first two parts of love letters. And now she turned to translation to French fashionable works for alternative sources of income. And at the time, French literature in English was becoming an increasingly marketable commodity. Lamont was her her fourth translation from the French. It came after Talleyrand's second voyage, the first voyage to the Isle of Love, which which has connection with Lamont, so I'll come back to it. Lamont appeared the year when Behn's comedy The Lucky Chance was performed by the United Company, And the play presents also some interesting overlaps with the society of fops and coquettes, busy making love and playing games that form the background of La Manche. So a little bit about the cultural background of the French work, a work which was particularly fashionable in elite French circles, steeped in preciosité. It is a prose narrative interlaced with verse known as prosimètron, a form that was not particularly fashionable in England at the time. It bears, as I said, similarities to the Talmud works that she translated first and second, and she was going to translate the second Talmud work later in 1688. All these are in the spirit of French galanterie, a notion which is often misunderstood and about which I'd like to say a few words. Gallantry is really an aristocratic ethos, I think, shared by honnêtes gens, gentlemen and ladies. So an ideal of civility and sociability based on courtesy, politeness, conversation, the mastery of the art of conversation, and a particular form of wit. It best flourished in France in the collective miscellanies printed in the latter half of the 17th century, where apparent anonymity is in fact a convention within an elite network and became an expression of its tastes, pastimes, and values. So under the combined influence of preciosité, which attributed to women a central role, social and intellectual role, the subject matter of love became hegemonic. And we saw, the period saw a publication of scores of essays, poems, and works of fictions, which claimed to define and regulate love and friendship, especially among the sexes. This genre was influenced by Paris précieuses, such as Madame de Scudéry, who offered a very famous allegorical model to think about love, this influential carte of tendre, the carte de tendre, map of tenderness, famous allegorical map of love discussed in the first part of her romance, Clélia, originally Clélie, 1654, translated almost immediately into English. The engraving was known in England. Oh, sorry. I mean, this goes to show how, the critical fortune, it is about the critical fortune of this map, which is still very much part and parcel of collective imagination today. But sorry, that was just an excursus. And of course, you know that famous dress, which also includes a representation of the map of Tender. Anyway, so the engraving was known in England. It was copied. Sorry, I seem to have missed the English version of it. Oh, yes, it's. Never mind. Sorry, one of my slides has gone. The engraving was known in England. It was copied to illustrate the new edition of the Romances translation in 1678. It purports to take lovers from new friendship to tender, staying clear of the lake of indifference and the dangerous sea of passion. It was often imitated and became a common horizon of reference for a whole generation of readers and authors. So the piece that Ben chose to translate must be read in the context of this literary and cultural craze. Bonnecorse's allegorical watch of love is a temporal equivalent of Scudéry's spatial allegory, in the context of a fashionable literature which discussed objects of everyday life as visual aids. There was a whole literature of objects that flourished in France at the time. There's even a speaking mirror in Bonnecorse's text, a speaking mirror which features in the second part of the narrative and is a precursor of many 18th century narratives in which objects become narrators. So the choice of the watch now must also, of course, be seen in the context of the development of horology in the period and the increasing popularity of personal watches among the urban elite. Bonnecorse's 1671 sequel, which Ben includes in her translation, adds the case of the watch and a mirror to the list of luxury items that could be considered as status symbols. Although they had become more common, mirrors were still precious objects in the second half of the 17th century, especially large ones, because they were more difficult to make. Mirrors, of course, featured in all gentlemen's and ladies' dressing rooms and cabinets, so it was also a way of sort of accessing the space, domestic space, a space of interiority. And in La Montre, the mirror and the watch and its case are exploited for their symbolic status as domestic personal objects for the wealthy and idle. These vanity objects also happen to be intimate objects that reflect not just status, but also personal taste. The watch is worn as an accessory against the body, and the mirror reflects the physical appearance, often capturing the body's nudity. As literary objective correlatives, these intimate things allow the reader direct access to the private space of the self, boudoir, or cabinet, dressing room, and bedroom, and to the character's intimacy, both physical and psychological. This is an aspect of the narrative that Behn particularly responds to by introducing changes that give more intense feelings to her female narrator, Iris, and she also enhances her sensuality. There's also an aspect of national rivalry between France and England in the 17th century, which Behn plays to. She clearly plays on the critical view that sees translation as an improvement of the original. By the time she was writing, France and England were actually engaged in a fierce competition as far as the technological advances of watches were concerned. It was very usual, I mean, it was actually quite common to have an English watch with a French case, because the French were known for their ornate boxes for watches, whereas the English watches had acquired the reputation for being really solid and reliable. And finally, of course, we can also see Bonacorsi's book as a lay version of the Book of Hours for lovers. Bonacorsi adapts the principle of the map of tender with the Watch of Love, and which comes with its own maps. Oh, that was my English map. Oh, well. So this is the map that comes, or the watch that comes with Bonacorsi's book. The watch sent by Iris to Damon, which is both the narrative itself and this allegorical concept, the watch materialized through the engraved representation of Cupid's watch, whose gradation corresponds to 24 hours and the 24 sections of the book. So under the fictional guise, the book adapts the idea of the didactic manual of love. Its specificities that it introduces a woman's viewpoint in a literature that was so often dominated by male speakers, which is one of the aspects of the text that appealed to Behn, obviously, and she responds to it by making very significant changes to the text. And I'll stop at that for today. Thank you.
So much. I think will complement that very nicely. Our third speaker in this evening's section is Dr. Batt, from the University of Bristol, who's going to talk about another of Behn's translations, Lycidas.
Thank you very much. So I'm editing Behn's Lycidas. And I want to talk about a couple of annotations and where they've taken me down some rabbit holes, I'm afraid, and what bigger questions they might open up about the cultural, intellectual and social world that Behn was a part of. Lycidas, which was published in 1688, is one of Behn's least known prose works. It is a sequel to her much more famous long poem, A Voyage to the Isle of Love. And like that text, and in some ways, like some of the texts that Liam was just talking about, it is an allegorical text. Lycidas is a first-person narrative account of a traveller's journey across the allegorical landscape of love, sex, and desire. It's a translation, as Liam has just suggested, with some additions of a French text, Paul Talamon's two-part allegorical narrative. Give my French, Le Voyage and Le Second Voyage de l'Île d'Amour. Sorry, Liam. Sort of murdered. I think that's all the French done. So, right. So in Lycidas, Behn follows Tallemant reasonably closely. But what I want to talk about today are two additions that she makes to Tallement's text, where she makes an allusion that has no precedent in her source. And both of these allusions that I'm going to talk about are to the myth of Venus and Adonis. So the first of these comes as Lycidas, the text narrator, recounts his first love affair on the island of Love with a woman called Sylvia. From a position of bitter experience, Lycidas looks back on his first flush of adoration of Sylvia, where he compared her to all of the fopperies fond lovers dress their idols in, that is, to the suns, the stars, the coral, the pearl, the roses, the lilies, angel spheres, and goddesses. And the goddess specifically that he compared her to was Venus. He had believed, he says, that when she walked Venus in the myrtle grove, when she advanced to meet her loved Adonis, assuming all the grace young loves could give, had not so much of majesty as Sylvia. Okay, so that's one allusion to Venus and Adonis, and here's the second. It comes a few pages later in the text. So unbeknownst to Lycidas, Sylvia has taken another lover, and everybody but Lycidas knows this. So he can tell the attitude to him has changed. He hasn't yet worked it out, and he explains how he found out from one of the island's allegorical entities, a character called Fame, who tells him the rumours. So one day, lying under a solitary shade, with my sad thoughts fixed on my declining happiness and almost drowned in tears, I saw a woman dressed in glorious garments, all loose and flowing with the wind, scouring the fields and groves with such a pace as Venus, when she heard her loved youth was slain, hasted to behold her ruin. And he finds out this woman is called Fame, and Fame says, Sylvia's got another lover, you idiot. A paraphrase, but only sort of. So my first impression was, with these allusions, was, okay, this is going to be easy to gloss, but knowing that Elaine would not let me get away with a vague, unsubstantiated gesture in the direction of mythological stories, I turned to the most obvious sources, Ovid's Metamorphoses and Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis. And this is where things get interesting, and I do want to assure, particularly Elaine and Claire, this is going in the head notes, not footnotes. Versions of Ovid, which is like the standard source of Venus and Adonis myths, isn't it? Were not massively helpful. There was nothing either in Golding's 16th century translation nor Sandy's 17th century translation that spoke to either of these ideas that I'm trying to wrestle with, which is kind of Venus carrying herself so beautifully and Venus running quite quickly, hearing on the death of Adonis. But Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis does give us a fast-moving Venus. His poem is riddled with references to Venus hurrying, both before and after she fears that Adonis has been killed. She hasteth to a myrtle grove. All in haste she coasteth to the cry, hasting to feed her fawn. Then as she approaches Adonis's body, as falcons to the lure, away she flies. The grass stoops not, she treads on it so light, and in her haste, unfortunately, she spies the foul boar's conquest on her fair delight. So for the fast-moving Venus, Shakespeare is a plausible gloss. And I think this quickly moving Venus is one that Batt's had in mind for several years, because it also appears in her poem, The Disappointment, first published in 1680, when Chloris flees from her disappointing sexual encounter with Lysander and is compared to the goddess in her flight. So Venus, when her love was slain, with fear and haste through the fatal plain. So Shakespeare gives me a Venus moving at haste, but there's nothing in Shakespeare that gives me a kind of a majestic and graceful Venus. You know the poem, Venus is not graceful nor elegant in it, nor is she irresistibly beautiful. She's sort of big and clumsy, and Adonis is doing everything to resist her. Venus in the myrtle grove, when she advanced towards her loved Adonis, assuming all the graces young loves could give, had not so much of majesty as Sylvia. So where do I find that? And it's worth drawing in another of Behn's texts here, another poem. So in her Pindaric poem on the happy coronation of James II from 1685, in that poem, the beauty of the new king and queen is compared to that of Venus and Adonis. Particularly Mary of Modena, there's this image of her with a retinue of 1,000 little loves, or also described as young waiting cupids, who basically dress the queen. And while they do so, or as they do so, the goddess, the queen, pleased to see their toils, scatters 10,000 graces from her smiles. So we've got a lot of the same sort of stuff going on here. We've got the little loves, the young loves, and Ben in Lycidas sort of uses Cupid and love interchangeably. So Ben might have, in this reference in Lycidas, she might be thinking back to this poem where she talked about a literal majesty being like Venus, and when she's talking about Sylvia, or when Lycidas is talking about Sylvia being majestic, she might also be thinking about the queen being majestic. But what I really want to argue is that what she's doing here with this repeated image of Venus being dressed by Cupids, that it is prompted by the opera Venus and Adonis by the composer John Blow. This was first performed at court in 1683 or 84, where the role of Venus was taken by the former actor and former mistress of Charles II, Moll Davis, and that of Cupid by her and Charles's daughter, Lady Elizabeth Tudor. Later, this opera, Venus and Adonis, will be performed at Josiah Priest's Chelsea School for Young Women. It's been hailed as one of the key works of early English opera. It's considered to be a major influence on Purcell's Dido and Aeneas. So John Blow, who composed the opera, Ben certainly knew him because he composed songs for her play The Lucky Chance, which came out in 1687, so about the time she's working on Lycidas. Other works by Ben also put her in this sort of musical performance space, including a dialogue for an entertainment at court between Damon and Sylvia, which was published in 1684, and Celinda and Chloris, made in an entertainment at court, published in 1685. And her dialogue, Venus and Cupid, which was posthumously published in 1692, doesn't have that kind of tag performed at court, but it has stage direction for chorus, suggests performance, and it contains textual references to the court and to a proud monarch, which suggests it might have been performed at court. Even if she didn't see Venus and Adonis in one of these court performances, she could have seen it in its subsequent staging at Josiah Priest's school, since those were performances that had a small public audience. And Ben, with her theatrical connections and her interest in dramatic innovations, might have been there, conceivably. So the second act of Blow's Venus and Adonis fits with Ben's vision of Lycidas, Venus in Lycidas, quite well. While Adonis in the opera is off hunting, Venus calls for the Graces, whose duty it is to keep her magazine of beauty. And as the stage directions indicate, the Graces then dance around her, an assortment of little Cupids dress Venus. One combs her hair, another ties a bracelet of pearls around her wrist. So her allusion, Ben's allusion and thinking to Venus in the myrtle grove, going to meet Adonis and assuming all the graces young loves could give, might conceivably kind of relate to this scene of Venus being dressed in this opera. So I've been calling this Blow's Venus and Adonis, but that is covering a whole can of worms. So Blow didn't write the words to Venus and Adonis, and we don't know who did. The authorship of the libretto is a contested issue. Maureen Duffy proposed Ben might have written it. James Wynne has argued that Anne Kingsmill, later Anne Finch, Countess of Winchelsea, wrote it when she was maid of honour to Mary of Modena. I don't buy that, really, and necessarily on his evidentiary basis, and Jennifer Keith left it out of her edition of Anne Finch recently. Andrew Pinnock, meanwhile, has proposed Anne Killigrew, and whether Anne Killigrew wrote it or not, what she did, and I don't know how well you can see it, she did paint a scene, she painted several scenes from this opera, including one called Venus Attired by the Graces, which is doing all of the same sorts of work that I want it to do, really. So the painting doesn't map onto the opera exactly, because the Venus is being attired by the Graces rather than by Cupids. There's a little Cupid flying in the sky. Ben might have known the painting. Maybe there's something about an association with Killigrew that could be pulled out further. But maybe I'm sort of thinking that Ben probably maybe knew the operatic version of Venus and Adonis. Maybe she had that in mind when she wrote her panegyric celebration of Mary of Modena. Maybe she still had it in mind when she was working on Lycidas a couple of years later. So, as you can see, Behn's passing allusions to Venus and Adonis set me on a trail down some rabbit holes, possibly out the other side, don't know, which still down there, to be honest, which puts Behn at one of the most important early works at opera, if you believe what I'm saying. If anybody's got pot shots that they want to take at this theory, please do, and shoot it down, because please do, if it needs to, because it's a house of cards at the moment. But I think it makes sense to put Behn in that space, given her interest in theatrical innovation and in spectacle. If anybody's doing any thinking about Behn and opera, I would love to know more. Equally, if anybody's done anything thinking about the authorship of this specific opera, I'd like to know more about that. If anybody's got any Venus and Adonises that I should have looked at instead, tell me now, for God's sake. And if there's anything about Behn and Killigrew that I also ought to be following up, tell me that too. But thank you very much. That's me done.